Today is World Mental Health Day, where we are all encouraged to talk about mental health in general and think about whether society is doing enough to protect those who might be struggling. Earlier on, we were joined by the actor David Harewood. You probably know him best from this.
The terrorists are still out there, after blood. We need Brody in the public eye, reminding America that this is far from over.
That's the critically acclaimed spy thriller Homeland. But he was actually here to talk about something far more personal, his own struggles with mental health. He first experienced psychosis back in his early 20s and was actually sectioned under the Mental Health Act. He's been examining his experience and how being black and British impacted that journey in a documentary as well as a memoir that was released last year. I started tonight by asking him to take us back to what happened all those years ago.
Basically, I had a psychotic breakdown. And psychosis is a very peculiar condition where it's delusions and you hear things or you see things that aren't there. And it was a really sort of powerful, mind-shattering experience, which is actually very, very, very common. But it's basically as a result of stress, increased anxiety, heavy dependence on various substances, a lot of drinking, overthinking, not sleeping, and all of that sort of exploded in this very sort of florid and kind of deeply traumatic psychotic experience.
And for you, we're here today talking about the sort of the racial element to that as well. How much did that charge what happened to you back then? Maybe society was different, maybe culturally things were different. And how do you look back at that now?
When I did the documentary, one of the scenes in the documentary, I was handed my medical records from 30 years ago. They'd found them. And I didn't open that envelope for 2 years, but when I did open it and read it, all of it, a lot of the things that I was saying, a lot of things that were confusing at the time, all to do with my race and my identity and how confused I was around those issues of who I was and what I was. Writing the book has enabled me to sort of go back to my youth, growing up in the 60s and 70s when there were no positive images of black people, where the black and white minstrel show was on every Saturday night. So how peculiar was that for me, a young black boy growing up in Birmingham, being constantly told to go back to where you came from? So growing up in that environment, it's not surprising for me, looking back on it, that my view of who I was and what I was slightly sort of disturbed.
And when you do shine a light on a subject, sometimes some of those things you discover are a little uncomfortable, like that fact that black people are 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act than white people. What is the basis? What is the structure that allows that to happen, and how does that change?
It's very difficult, and black people are overrepresented in the mental health system, and I talk about this with my therapist, but it's I think the pressures that black people are under, maybe we underestimate those pressures, because it's very much, if you're living in the middle of, if I was living in the middle of Ghana, or in the middle of, deepest, Africa, I would call that very much a black space. I'd be in a black environment, but I'm not. I'm living in what I call a white environment. It's very much a white space. And that's not a derogatory thing, but that's just where we are. And I think being in that space where you can be continually othered, whether it's a cab driving past you or somebody making a crass joke, or the sun's out, why are you in the sun? You're dark enough. All these kind of casual cuts of a thing, all these slight microaggressions, they build up and they build up and they build up, and sometimes they can sort of explode. And I think we underestimate the pressures. I know it's after George Floyd, there was this enormous amount of empathy that came out throughout the world. There was an enormous amount of empathy about the plight of black people. But that window very quickly started closing, and now it's almost been weaponized. This idea of wokeism, that anything that is even remotely sort of open-minded when it comes to race is just deemed woke, and it's
quite negative.
And negatively, and it's awful. So I find that quite a pressure that you sort of bring up a subject and people switch off immediately, and that's a really dangerous place to be, because your concerns, my legitimate concerns, or worries or fears, if I'm in an office and I'm the only black person in that office, and there's, people are making jokes and without even thinking of my presence, and I'm just supposed to laugh at it. And if I do sort of put my hand up and say, actually, guys, I don't find that funny, you're just going to be slaughtered. And if that means that you then have to just start swallowing all this anxiety, swallowing all this, or your concerns, and not talking about them, that's going to put you in a very, very difficult position.
Thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate your openness and your honesty talking about these issues. And I'm sure what you've said today will help an awful lot of people.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.